Let me tell you about the greatest heist in human history. Not a bank robbery, not a con, not a coup. A country robbing another country in broad daylight for over 200 years straight. And not just robbing them, using their own money to build a bigger empire, then turning around and enslaving a quarter of the planet with it. The victim? Spain. The most powerful empire the world had ever seen. The thief? A cold, rainy, resource-barren island off the coast of Europe that had nothing. No silver, no gold, no spices, no colonies worth mentioning, a population smaller than modern-day London. A navy that, in 1500, was a joke, England. And here's what makes this story genuinely insane. England didn't just steal Spain's empire. It replaced it. Then it built something so much bigger, so much more ruthless, so much more sophisticated that Spain looks like a warm-up act. By 1920, Britain controlled 24% of the entire planet's land surface and 23% of the world's population. From nothing, from a rainy island, here's exactly how they did it, step by step. No sugarcoating. First, let's establish just how pathetic England was when Spain was at its peak. In 1500, England was a backwater. Full stop. While Spain was conquering entire continents, England was still fighting itself. The Wars of the Roses had just ended. The country was broke, politically unstable, and completely irrelevant on the world stage. Spain had Herna en court, us conquering the Aztec Empire with 500 men in sheer audacity. England had sheep farmers in Yorkshire. Spain had a fleet of 130 warships. England had barely 30. Spain had universities in Mexico City. England had peasants who couldn't read. Henry VII, England's king in 1485, was so desperate to get in on the colonial game that he hired an Italian, John Cabot. Because England literally didn't have an explorer good enough to send, Cabot found Newfoundland, cod, freezing cold. Nothing useful. Spain found gold mountains and silver rivers. So how does this story end with England on top? It starts with one decision, one that Spain never understood until it was far too late. England decided that stealing was more profitable than mining. Enter Elizabeth I, 1558, queen of a broke, mid-sized island nation that owes money to half of Europe. She looks at Spain's treasure fleets crossing the Atlantic twice a year, loaded with more silver than the entire English economy, and she makes a calculation that would have made a mob boss blush. Why dig for gold when you can just take someone else's? She called them privaters. The rest of the world called them what they were. Pirates. The difference? A piece of paper from the Queen saying it was legal. That's it. Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, John Hawkins. These weren't heroic explorers. These were state-sponsored criminals operating with royal permission. And Drake, let's talk about Drake for a second. 1577, Elizabeth gives him ships, funding, and a quiet nod. He sails around the entire world, only the second man in history to do it, robbing every Spanish port and ship he finds along the way. He comes home in 1580 with treasure worth £600,000 in a single voyage. That was half of England's entire annual government revenue, from one man. One trip. Elizabeth's cut? She paid off England's entire foreign debt. Invested the rest. And knighted Drake on the deck of his own ship. Spain's ambassador was screaming in the English court demanding justice. Elizabeth smiled and promoted Drake to admiral. That is the move. That is the energy. Spain had the world's biggest piggy bank. England just kept smashing it. By 1588, Spain had had enough. Philip II, King of Spain, ruler of half the world, decided to end England once and for all. He assembled the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 men, the most powerful naval force ever assembled up to that point in history. The plan: sail to England, link up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands, invade, dethrone Elizabeth, and make England a Catholic colony. Simple, overwhelming, should have worked. It didn't. The English fleet was smaller, faster, more maneuverable, and commanded by the same pirates who'd spent decades learning exactly how Spanish ships moved and where they were weak. Drake, the same Drake, Spain had been complaining about for years, personally led fire ships into the anchored Armada at Gravelines. Burning ships, chaos, panic. Then the weather finished the job. Storms battered the retreating Armada around Scotland and Ireland. Half the fleet sank. 20,000 Spanish sailors died. England lost 0 ships. Philip II reportedly locked himself in his room for a week. And this is the moment everything changes. Because Spain didn't just lose ships. Spain lost the myth of invincibility. Every small nation in Europe watching that battle learned the same lesson simultaneously. Spain can be beaten. And England, tiny, scrappy, pirate-funded England, just proved it. Now here's where England does something Spain never thought of. 1600, Elizabeth I signs a royal charter for a new organization. The East India Company, not a government agency, not a military unit. A corporation. With its own army, its own navy, its own courts. Its own currency, its own foreign policy. A private company, run by London merchants, given the legal power to declare war, sign treaties, and govern entire nations. This is the most important organizational innovation in the history of capitalism. And it was used to commit some of the most staggering acts of violence and extraction the world has ever seen. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Show up somewhere with valuable trade goods. India, China, Southeast Asia. Step 2. Offer to trade. Be very friendly. Very reasonable. Step 3. Once you have a foothold, a port, a warehouse, a trading agreement, bring in the soldiers. Step 4. Play local rulers against each other. Fund one side's civil war. Install a puppet. Step 5. Now you own the tax revenue of an entire subcontinent. By 1750, the East India Company wasn't trading with India. It was running India. 200 million people, governed by a London boardroom. The annual tax revenue extracted from Bengal alone was more than the entire GDP of Britain when Elizabeth chartered the company 150 years earlier. Spain dug silver out of mountains using slave labor. England built a machine that made entire civilizations work for it and charged them for the privilege. This is the part that explains everything. Spain got the silver. England got the system. While Spain was shipping treasure home and spending it on wars and churches, England was doing something completely different with money. The Bank of England, 1694. The world's first modern central bank. Created specifically to turn private savings into government power. Suddenly, England could borrow money at 3% interest, while Spain was paying 40%. Think about what that means in war. You and your enemy both need to spend £10 million to fight. You borrow it at 3%. They borrow it at 40%. Over 10 years, they've paid back £14 million extra just in interest. That's an entire extra army, bought with nothing but a better credit rating. The London Stock Exchange, Lloyd's of London. The bond market. England financialized everything. Risk, trade, war, harvest failures, ship voyages. You could bet on anything, hedge against anything, fund anything. A merchant in Bristol could invest in a ship going to India, insure it against sinking, sell shares in the cargo before it arrived, and pocket profit without leaving his chair. Spain was moving metal. England was moving money itself, faster, further, and more ruthlessly than anyone had ever imagined possible. The whole world became England's balance sheet. And then, because history has a vicious sense of humor, England did one final thing to Spain. It took Spain's own colonies. The Spanish Empire in Latin America had been crumbling for decades. Revolutions, independence movements, bankruptcy. By the early 1800s, Spain's grip on its colonies was breaking apart. Who stepped in to trade with the newly independent nations of Latin America? Britain. British merchants flooded into Buenos Aires, Rio, Caracas, Lima. British banks financed their new governments. British goods replaced Spanish ones. British investors owned their railroads, their ports, their mines. Spain lost its colonies politically. Britain owned them economically. They called it informal empire. You don't need a flag if you control the money, and the crowning insult? When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, walking into Madrid like he owned the place, it was the British who eventually drove him out. At the cost of making Spain permanently dependent on British military protection, the thief became the bodyguard. Spain never recovered. So what actually happened here? Spain had a resource. England built a machine. Spain extracted wealth. England manufactured wealth. Out of thin air, out of debt instruments. Out of corporations, out of other people's labor, out of information and risk and time itself. Spain thought power was treasure. England understood that power is systems. Systems that keep producing, keep compounding, keep expanding, long after the original source is gone. The East India Company outlasted every Spanish galleon ever built. The Bank of England is still operating today. Over 330 years later, Lloyd's of London still insures ships. The London financial system that England built in the 1600s and 1700s is the direct ancestor of Wall Street, the IMF, the World Bank, and every hedge fund running algorithms in Singapore right now. England isn't running the world anymore. But the machine England built still is. That's not an accident. That's the point. Here's the uncomfortable truth this story leaves you with. The most successful empires in history weren't the ones with the most resources. They were the ones who figured out how to make everyone else's resources work for them. Spain had the gold. England had the game. And the game, the financial system, the corporate structure, the debt machine, the legal framework, didn't care who built it or why, it just kept running. It's still running. Next time you use a bank, buy a stock, pay interest on a loan, sign a contract. You're living inside a system that a cold, rainy island invented to rob Spain. And it worked so well nobody ever turned it off.